Raise your hand if you've ever gone to visit a layout and while all the track work was in, it had no scenery. Raise your other hand if your layout is all track and no scenery. How many of you have two hands up? How many of you only have one hand up because you put the first hand down even though I didn't say you could? How many of you have no hands up because you're too cool to raise your hands while watching a video and you think I can't see you anyway? Well, I can see you, and you cheated. Yeah, think about that. Hi everybody, I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. In this episode, we're going to start scenery for the small layout I'm calling the Grunge. You can put your hands down now. You know, I understand why there are so many plywood Pacific layouts out there. Scenery, like weathering, is a task that many people fear. The typical arguments apply here. I'm not good at it, or I don't want to mess it up, and so on. But if you really want viewers to become immersed in the illusion of your layout that you're trying to create, scenery is a necessity. For the uninitiated, a plywood Pacific is a layout that has benchwork and track, but no scenery. I'm not sure if it's supposed to refer to an ocean of plywood, or if it's just a clever play on prototype railroad names like Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, and so on. But either way, it's a thing. Trust me. Now, I'll be honest, while I love building structures and I enjoy making roads and sidewalks, I'm less keen on the landscaping elements of scenery. Grass, trees, ballasting, that kind of thing. And I'm sure that's part of the reason why I gravitate towards urban layouts. Before we go on, just a reminder that this channel covers model railroading, including planning, hints, tips, how-tos, and updates. Click on the subscribe button to stay up to date, and then click on the bell to make sure that you'll get notified when there is new content available. When we last saw the Grunge, it looked like this. Some structures, but for the most part, bare sub-roadbed. I decided it was time to scenic this end of the layout. The three structures that are built so far are American Can, which is the first industry any train entering the layout encounters, a tenement house because every neighborhood needs some housing, and Laida's Joint, the local watering hole, because every neighborhood needs a place where everybody knows your name. Wait, no, that's a different place, I'm sorry. In phase one of the scenery, we'll add pavement for the street, sidewalks, a delivery spot for trucks on the east side of the American Can building, a wooden grade crossing, and a rough area of dirt and weeds between Laida's Joint and the tenement house. Phase 2 will be to add road markings, a ramp for the team track area, tall grass between the runaround tracks, and more pavement to the west side of American Can. So let's go through the steps I took for the first phase. I started by removing the structures from the layout so that I'd have a clean workspace and not have to worry about breaking anything. You can see that I already marked lines for where I wanted the sidewalks and the road to be. I marked them on the backdrop in pencil as well so that I could still have a point of reference once the cork was down. The sidewalks I'm using in front of the truck dock are from Rick's, and this piece has a ramp molded into it. The ramp wasn't located in quite the right spot for me to use that piece as is, so the paper that's taped to the sidewalk piece was used to cut the sidewalk sections to size once I was ready. The team track extended out into the area where I wanted the road to be. That needed to be taken care of next. When I initially laid the track, I had intentionally left the team track long so that I could give it a close fit once I put the street in. Now that I knew where the street and sidewalks would actually be located, it was time to cut the track down to size. I marked the edges of the road and the sidewalk and then cut the team track down to size. I did this with my rotary cutting tool, and to prevent any damage to the layout surface, I used a block of wood underneath it so that the cutting disc would not dig into the gator foam surface. I ended up taking about 1.25 inches off. That's 32 millimeters for those of you who speak metric. With this small piece cut off, I then removed the remaining plastic tie from underneath. For this, I used my Craftsman Handy Cut tool. I also mentioned this tool in my video on laying track for the Grunge. Using my sidewalk pieces as a guide, I determined that the track was still just a tad too long, so I cut the rails again. At this length, the track will end right at the sidewalk, but I plan to use a bumper to create a physical separation between the street and the team track. I don't want my scale people to get hurt. With the structures off the layout, but before the scenery went in, I took the opportunity to give the track a good scrub. There were still areas where there was leftover paint from when I painted the track. One of the great tips I got in the comments from that video was to use a block of wood to do this, rather than something abrasive like a Bright Boy. The wood gives you a nice solid surface, but is soft enough that it doesn't scratch and gouge the track like an abrasive block will. And as you can see here, it takes off quite a bit of gunk. Using the marks I made with the sidewalk as a guide, I extended that line all the way to the layout edge. I then put the American Can building back on the layout and marked its perimeter. Then I extended that line out to the street to mark where the delivery dock pavement would need to be. All of this was in preparation for putting down the cork. I decided to use cork sheet under the pavement and sidewalks. This would allow me to raise those features up so that the street would be roughly level with the tops of the rails and would give me a little elevation to play with for scenic materials like dirt, ground foam, and grass. This also meant I had a flat, stable surface to attach the road surface and sidewalks to. Measuring the width between the line and the edge of the layout gave me the dimensions for the first piece of cork. I then used the tenement structure foundation to mark where I could cut the cork out for the weedy area that was going to go next to the building. Even though I planned to use sidewalks of different widths from different manufacturers on each side of the grade crossing, I wanted the street width to be uniform. So I used the base for Laida's joint and the bar mill's sidewalk piece that would be going next to it to mark the width for the area where the tenement would eventually be. I would later cut the Rick's sidewalk piece that I was going to use next to the tenement down to size so that it would fit the base of that building. I used my 1, 2, 3 blocks to hold that section in place while I measured the distance between the track and the backdrop so that I could get the right size cork piece for the buildings to the north of the crossing. I temporarily weighed that down as well so that I could cut the cork piece that the American Can structure would sit on. Measuring the base for Laida's joint, I measured and cut the space for the weedy area on that side of the tracks. I then test fit the structures just to make sure everything looked the way I wanted it to. While I was at it, I also cut out the cork piece for the west side of American Can, but we'll cover that in a later video. Using full-strength white glue, I covered the surface of the cork, then attached it to the layout surface. I used plenty of weight to make sure that it laid flat and that it wouldn't end up with any bubbles. I repeated that process for the rest of the cork pieces. And I'll tell you what, a lot of time was spent waiting for the glue to dry, which is not quite as bad as watching paint dry, but almost. This process took a while. Finally, with the American Can building temporarily back in place, I measured and cut the small pieces that would fill out the delivery dock area and support the wide sidewalk on the northwest side of the crossing. I glued those in place, weighed them down, and, you guessed it, waited for them to dry. With the American Can structure now raised up by the cork, the support posts no longer touch the ground, so I had to remedy that. I thought the best way would be to put some foundation footings underneath each one. Since the cork comes in at 9/100ths or 90 thousandths of an inch, I decided to use some scrap 100 thousandths styrene that I had hanging around. This would ensure that the posts would touch. After measuring the size of the posts, I determined that squares of about 45/100ths of an inch, well, let's say roughly square because none of them are perfect, would do a good job. I tested them underneath the posts and marked their locations with numbers, then painted them with khaki paint to replicate concrete foundation. With the paint cured, I put a dab of straight white glue on each one of those, put them underneath the building in the appropriate order, did my best to straighten them out, and, yep, let them dry. Yay! More glue drying! While that was happening, I decided to paint the edges of the cork so that its brown color would be less noticeable. I used black craft paint for the areas where pavement would show. I ended up using polyscale concrete paint to paint the edges around the sidewalks. I initially tried using the pebble paint that I used for the foundation of the tenement, but after spraying it into the cup, I found that it was too runny out of the can for this application, so I ended up going with the thicker paint from the bottle. I then moved on to the sidewalks. I needed to trim down the sidewalk pieces that go in front of the tenement, as well as cut out a spot for the tenement's stoop. This required some work with the nibbler tool, as well as test fitting, followed by filing, followed by test fitting, followed by filing, followed by... yeah, you get the idea. As you can see, even so, I didn't get it perfectly straight. But I thought that that would be okay since I could use ground foam in those spots to represent weeds growing out of the gaps, which would be prototypical. The next step was to put as many elements in place as I could, and using some scrap paper, trace the edges of the roads, sidewalks, and truck loading area. These would become the cutting templates for the foam road sections that I was going to use. Now that I didn't need to get the paper underneath the sidewalks anymore, I glued them all down to the cork. I did not yet glue down the tenement or the base for Laida's joint. Note that I did take a notch out of the corner of the sidewalk closest to the American Can building, just so that it had a perfect snug fit. For this project, and for most of the roads I do anywhere on a layout, I use foam. This is a method I picked up years ago from a model railroad forum, which I've then modified a little bit over time. I get the foam from eBay, specifically from a vendor called Wandy Foam. I'll put a link in the upper right corner here, as well as in the description below. You can purchase multiple sizes, but I usually get the 1mm variety and buy them in 12 by 18 inch sheets. I've also bought the thicker 6mm version that I will sometimes use underneath the top layer of foam instead of cork. I did this on the Monument City Terminal Division at General Motors. You can see the two layers in this photo. When I discovered this method, the person who had described it used craft paint and applied it to the surface of the foam with a sponge. I tried this and got mixed results. Now, I suspect that was a me problem and not a method problem, so feel free to give it a try and let me know how it works out for you. Instead, I use spray paint. I start with the full sheets of foam. I bought both black and light gray versions, and I color them both in similar but slightly different ways to represent pavement of different ages. A note here, asphalt is not really black, at least not the engine black that I've seen a lot of people paint what they say is pavement on their layouts. Even brand new pavement is not quite black, but a dark, dark gray, and it quickly fades. So I use gray primer and the same grimy black paint I use for roofs to color the foam. I'll also use a concrete color paint and an oxide red for highlights, but I use them quite sparingly as those colors tend to show up as the pavement ages, and even then only subtly. To paint the foam, I generally use short bursts with no real pattern or expectation of coverage. Too little is better than too much here, as you can always go back and add more or a different color. You'll note that the light gray sheet in the middle ended up with an odd splotchy pattern on it. It looks a little weird, but I thought this was okay, and actually a good thing since the coloration on pavement is rarely uniform. We'll be adding some weathering later as well, so this really shouldn't be a problem. Mix and match the paint colors until it looks right to you, favoring the grays of course. I suggest using some photos of actual pavement the first couple of times you try this until you get a feel for it. Let it dry and then repeat as needed until you get the look you want. With the pavement looking like I wanted, I used the templates of the road areas I made earlier to cut out the road sections. I taped the templates to the foam using Scotch tape, or sticky tape if you prefer. I then just cut on the template lines. The foam is thin and flexible, so you can use a utility knife, a hobby knife, or just plain old scissors to cut it. I started by cutting out the pieces for the streets, which, except for a small bump out near the backdrop by Laida's joint, were basic rectangles. I then moved to the area of the truck dock, cutting the main section with scissors, but then using my hobby knife to cut out the spot where the stairs leading to the personnel door jut out from the building. Returning to the layout, I laid these pieces in place to make sure there was a good fit, making any adjustments as necessary. In those places where brown cork was showing through, I touched them up with a black marker. My intention here is to use a wooden crossing. And that'll fit width-wise very well. The center drops in there and gives good clearance. But the sides sit on top of the tie plates and don't sit on there very well. So I've got two choices. One is to trim the molded on tie plates so that these sit flush, or to sand these down, and this is just laser cut wood. So I think I'm going to go with option B. Once we get that in, I can stain those and we'll see how that goes, but I'm gonna go sand these down. So in an attempt to get these to be as even as possible, I have taped these down using some painter's tape, and now I'm just gonna sand these down using this side is pretty coarse here, and hopefully I don't damage the heck out of it, but we will see, because I do need to take a reasonable amount of material off. That's thin though. Whoa, that's actually thinned them out way too much, as you can see. So that was highly effective. Perhaps too highly effective. But that might actually, the broken piece here might actually serve my purposes quite well. This piece here kind of broke off. But I'm going to go measure these, and I got to assume now that they're thin enough not to be a problem. We'll go measure this, make sure that they lay flush, and then stain them. Those fit quite well, actually, and a bit of a lesson learned there. Next time I try this, because I've got a couple other places that I intend to use these, I'll either use the finer side of that sanding block, or maybe just use my emery board. But what I was hoping to do there, and I think it achieved it pretty well, was make sure that it removed the same amount of material all the way across. While that might not have been 100% true, this end down here does look to be not as thin as the other end. It is certainly thinner than this piece. This is the original thickness, and it's much thinner than that. What we're going to do now is just use some of the 1:60 India ink wash before. I've also got a 1/64 burnt umber wash that I'm going to use here. Same concept. It's a burnt umber India style ink in 70% alcohol, and we just kind of dip and brush. So let's give that a try. And this is going to soak into the wood and give it some natural looking weathering. One thin piece is going to be troublesome, it looks like, but we'll see how we do. I'm just eyeballing this to see how it's going to look. I'm going to do a mix of the two just to give it some dark look. With the alcohol mixed in here, it's going to either evaporate quickly or soak in quickly, and we'll be able to get an idea of how that's going to look in just a minute or two. So giving that a chance to dry just a little bit, and it's not as dark as I want it to be. I really want this to look quite old and beat up. So I'm gonna go pretty heavy on this. Leave some pools on top. Once that evaporates, I'll do the same thing with the burnt umber to give it some rusty look about it, and see how that ends up. So while we're waiting for that evaporation to take place, I'm going to cut out a marker for this. This is the piece that attaches the staging plate to the main layout, and I want to make sure that as I go on to the next step, which is putting down some scenic material, that area doesn't get covered. So I'm going to put the tape down in order to prevent that from happening. Just double check that I've cut through, because it did not appear that I went all the way through on the other side. There we go. So this connecting piece goes right in here like this. I want to make sure that I don't get any scenic material stuck on there that's going to prevent that from sliding in and out the way that it's supposed to. Like that. Okay, that should work pretty well. Still a little crooked, but let's try it now. Yeah, that'll work. What I am going to do here is kind of flood this area with glue. This is a mixture of 2 parts glue to 1 part water and 1 part alcohol. And you can see I've put down a protective layer of foam core here so that when I put this stuff down it doesn't fall on the rug. This first layer that I'm putting down is pretty coarse stuff. But that's because there's a lot of ground to cover here in terms of height. So I want to fill as much of that as I can with this sort of coarser stuff, and then I'll go over the top and take that out. I don't want that to get glued down just yet. Put a little more glue down over here, because that's the area that's got to get filled up. Who's put any in here? Got some just straight alcohol here that I'm going to use as a wetting agent. And what I will do is come back later with the vacuum cleaner and suck up any of the excess. So that will need to dry for a little while, and by then the crossing pieces should be ready to go as well. I used pan pastels off camera to weather the sidewalks. Actually, I thought it was on camera, but I can't find any footage of that, so sorry. Here we have the truck dock. This area gets a lot of use, and vehicles sit here as they get loaded and unloaded a lot. Over time, oil and grease drip down from the trucks onto the pavement. I represent this by applying some of my black India ink wash with a micro brush. You can see here how just dabbing it onto the pavement surface causes the color to transfer, and it actually spreads out a little bit, just kind of like oil would. I use the truck as a size guide so that it looks like the oil and grease come from the appropriate areas of the trucks. After that, I glued the pavement for the truck dock area down with straight white glue. At the same time, I used a toothpick to apply glue along the edge of the building. I then added ground foam by pouring some into a folded piece of paper and gently blew the ground foam in. As you blow, it'll stick to the wet glue. I actually went a bit heavy on that, so I went back after it dried and removed some of the ground foam with my finger. I weighted down the truck dock area to dry, then moved on to the street areas, again using straight white glue. I also put some ground foam in a couple of areas there where it was bare to represent weeds. Later, I went back and vacuumed up the excess. Finally, I took my stained grade crossing and glued that into place as well, using a weight once again to make sure that it made good contact. Just wow. That was a lot, but it was all well worth it. These before and after photos showed the dramatic difference this relatively easy process makes to the look and feel of the area. So that's all for this episode. Even though this kind of scenery work isn't my favorite thing, it ended up being pretty easy, if slightly time-consuming. And I'm pretty happy with the results as well. We're continuing to make progress on the layout, and that is a good thing. In the next episode, we'll continue with scenery, including weathering the streets, putting in road markings, and adding more greenery, including static grass, so keep an eye open for that one. What do you think about the scenery so far? Any hints to make things go faster or easier? I'm all ears. Well, I guess eyes, so leave your thoughts in the comments below. That's also the place for questions and suggestions. Make sure you subscribe and click on the bell. I like me, I hope you like me, and I'd like YouTube to like me as well, so all of that helps get the algorithms moving in the right direction. Check out the playlists on your left to get more information on building the grunge layout as well as other great videos. I'm Joe Parker of the Pixel Depot. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll meet me next time in the trade room.